Well, good afternoon and thank you, or morning, depending on where you are joining us from. Thank you for joining our Climate and Health Learning Community webinar today. My name is Maddie Curry and I am the project coordinator for the Climate Ready Tribes Initiative, which this webinar series is funded through. We are so excited to have you all join us and thank you for taking an hour out of your busy Fridays to spend the time with us. Okay. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. So this presentation is being recorded, as I just said, and it will be posted on the NIHB website after this gets wrapped up. Your microphone is currently muted, so please keep it this way until we either ask for questions or leave questions till the end. You can also, if you have any questions, you can feel free to write them in the chat box as we go along, and we'll answer them as Chris kind of goes through it. And then last thing, there will be an evaluation survey sent out to all of you, and we would really appreciate it if you could fill this out as it provides us with information on how to improve our webinars for you all. So thank you for that. So the NIHB, just really fast, the NIHB Tribal Climate and Environmental Health Project hosts a series of learning community webinars throughout this year. The purpose of these webinars is to offer resources to learning, networking, and information sharing related to tribal climate health. While these webinar topics may not directly relate to climate change, they are important for addressing public health issues that are coming up with these solutions. So today it is climate related, and we are going to talk about the recent executive orders about climate change that were signed into action by President Biden. So because I am not a policy expert, our Policy Center Deputy Director, Chris Chavez, has graciously agreed to lead this webinar. Chris has a deep interest in the intersection of public policy and accesses to resources for rural communities. Chris has a Bachelor of Arts from Dartmouth College, where he majored in Native American Studies and Sociology, modified with public policy. He also has a Juris Doctor from Michigan State University, where he worked as a research assistant in Indigenous Law and Policy Center, and also a Master of Public Administration from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he was a North Carolina Public Service Fellow. Chris is extremely passionate about process improvement and management, and as Deputy Director of the Policy Center at NIHB, he led the improvement of the organization's regulations tracking system. And Chris is also from Robeson County, North Carolina, and a citizen of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina. So Chris, I will let you go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Maddie. So today we're going to discuss President Biden's climate change executive orders. So as I'm sure you all are aware, the president hit the ground running on executive actions. From the minute he took office, he began issuing executive orders on a variety of issues, including the pandemic, immigration, and climate change. And a lot of these orders sought to reverse what was done during the Trump administration. Some of them were new initiatives. So you have a mixed bag of things that the president kind of sought to do. But we're going to start off today, before we do a deep dive into the executive orders, we're going to talk about a very, very, very brief civics lesson of what is an executive order. So let's go to the next slide. So what is an executive order? And it's oftentimes very vaguely described in the media. So I wanted to kind of take a moment to make sure we're all on the same page here. But every president except George Washington has issued an executive order, with the exception of one, President William Henry Harrison, who passed away a month into his term. So he didn't really have much time to issue any executive orders. But every president except him, they've issued executive orders. It's very common throughout history. An executive order, when you kind of distill it down to its essence, is a signed and written directive from the President of the United States. So executive orders are published in the Federal Register, and they carry the full force of law and are codified in the Code of Federal Regulations. So again, executive order, it's a written and signed directive by the President, and they do carry the force of law. And as we'll see on the next slide here, the powers to issue an executive order are derived from two sources. So first of all, the president can exercise his powers in Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution that dictates that the president shall take care that the laws are faithfully executed. So the president can issue an executive order that deals with enforcing a law. He can also issue an executive order that is exercising an authority that was given through Congress as well. So you have two sources of power. You can either through the Constitution or through Congress. Again, the president does have that duty to ensure that laws are faithfully executed. So you'll often see an executive order that says, I'm issuing this executive order pursuant to this act. And it's an order that is involving carrying out that act. So again, executive orders at the finest level have to be something. It has to be something that comes from Congress or the Constitution. The president can't just wake up one day and issue executive orders that don't have a basis in either constitutional or congressional authority. So I want to make sure that folks are aware that these powers do have a basis and are being exercised pursuant to either congressional or constitutional authority. So next slide. So how do executive orders function? So if you ever read an executive order, you'll see that they say something to the effect of, I direct the Secretary of the Interior, for example, or I direct the Secretary of HHS. At the most foundational level, an executive order is the president as the head of the executive branch issuing a directive to the head of executive agencies in his capacity as the head of the executive branch. I think a way to think about this in kind of a layperson's point of view would be if your boss or your supervisor were to tell you to do something, within this framework, the president kind of functions as the boss of the agency heads, because even though the agency cabinet secretaries rather are approved by Congress, they still serve at the pleasure of the president. So the president in this capacity is assuming the role of their boss and giving them a directive to do something. Again, he is obviously, he's obviously boxed in by his actual authority, but that is kind of how they function. It's just an order from the president to the agency heads, kind of similar to how you get an order from your boss or supervisor. So next slide. So the president has issued 2 executive orders that broadly focus on climate change. And they're listed right here. So you have the first one, which is protecting public health and the environment and restoring science to tackle the climate crisis, which is executive order number 13,990. And it was issued on September 20th, 2021. The next one is tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, executive order number 14,008, issued on January 27, 2021. There was a third order that I looked at, and it dealt with climate change and migration, and that was more kind of a climate change migration from other countries. But that is something you may also want to look at if you're curious as well. The president has really made it a priority to look back at what has been done in prior administrations and figure out what can be done to either reverse those policies or build on pre-existing policies that are favorable towards combating climate change. I think that there's pretty broad agreement that climate change is probably the most important issue facing the world more broadly. And we also know that climate change has a disproportionate impact on communities of color, on disadvantaged communities. And lower resource communities are also, they have the fewest resources to combat climate change and take, and take steps to mitigate its impact. And we've seen the impact of climate change, in so many ways the past couple of years, whether it's, deserts are getting drier. We're seeing increased flooding in some areas. We're seeing increased extreme weather events in some areas. We're seeing, and I think an example of that, of the extreme event, it would be the deep cold we saw in Texas probably about a month ago, right? We're seeing the extreme shifts in climate. We're also seeing, increased prevalence of wildfires in places like California. So you're seeing all of these extreme events that are, you can attribute to climate change. And again, if you're, a lot of communities don't have the resources to respond to these changes. So, in the interest of equity, the president is moving towards how do we mitigate, these impacts, and how do we begin to reverse, the things that we've seen so far that can be attributed to climate change. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll start looking at these a little bit more in depth. So the first one I mentioned, and I apologize for the text being a bit small, but I'll read this portion to you. Protecting public health and the environment and restoring science to tackle the climate crisis. So section 1 of the order kind of outlines the Biden administration's policy. So I'll read this to you here quickly. Our nation has an abiding commitment to empower our workers and communities, promote and protect our public health and the environment, and conserve our national treasures and monuments, places that can secure our national memory. When the federal government has failed to meet that commitment in the past, it must advance environmental justice. And again, as I said, a large part of that is acknowledging the role of equity in climate change, and the fact that the impacts of this will be felt most acutely by the more lower resource communities. And he mentioned in here, it also mentions that, you know, the president wants to hold polluters, especially those who disproportionately harm communities of color and low-income communities, accountable, because again, you know, it is often, you know, low-income communities of color that bear the brunt of pollution, and that bear the brunt of a lot of these, you know, policies that these orders seek to address. So next slide. I think most fundamentally, the heads of the agencies are directed to review actions taken between January 20th, 2017 and January 20th, 2021. Again, that's the Trump administration. We saw President Trump took a number of actions that obviously conflict with President Biden's stated policy goals. So obviously, a part of moving forward is going back and seeing, okay, what has been issued in the past, and what do we need to like change? Do we need to revoke? And the president does rescind a number of the previous president's executive orders. But obviously, you know, you're asking the agency to review regulations. You're asking them to review other actions that were taken that may need to be reversed through subsequent rulemaking. So this is foundationally the president saying, okay, what regulations did your agency promulgate during the last administration, and what needs to be done to reverse that? And you see, he does say that he asked him to recommend what are some new actions that we could take, whether that involves, you know, new regulations, a new executive order. But again, everything ties back to what was said in Section 1. Is how do we, you know, combat climate change, preserve the environment, and begin to kind of reverse the impacts of what has been, I think, you know, something that's impacted, you know, lower resource communities more broadly or more acutely. So let's go to the next slide here. So one other part of this is also addressing the President Trump's decision to shrink, you know, Bear Ears National Monument and other national monuments around the country. And the president directs the Secretary of the Interior. Remember, executive orders are directives towards the heads of executive agencies. Directs the Secretary of the Interior to consult with other agency heads and tribal governments to review monument boundaries and conditions established under the executive orders issued by the Trump administration. Again, I think we saw during the Trump years a significant shrinking of national monuments and attempts to open up land for private development, which again is, if you look back, if you remember what I said a couple of slides ago, that kind of goes against the goals of the Biden administration and with this executive order. So, you know, you want the Secretary of the Interior to take a look at that, and within 60 days, the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, will issue it's to submit a report, to recommend actions that may be taken to address these issues. I'm not sure. I think the obvious question is here. You know, she was just confirmed a few days ago. Does that affect the timeline here? I haven't heard anything to that effect, and whether the timeline is being pushed back or how that's affected. I think we can assume that the acting Secretary of the Interior had already started on this work, and she'll pick up where they've kind of already done work. But again, this right here is just an initial step. There will obviously be, and I think one of the important things to remember about executive orders is that executive orders are the start of the conversation a lot of the time. There still has to be followed through by the agencies, and there's still other work to be done. So at the end of 60 days, the Secretary of the Interior will issue a report to the president to recommend steps to address these issues, and that may and probably will likely involve restoring the original boundaries of these national monuments. But this is the start of the process of reviewing some of those actions. So want to make sure I emphasize that. Next slide. We are also seeing moratoriums on oil and gas activity. So again, here is the directive to the Secretary of the Interior to place a temporary moratorium on oil and gas activity in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Again, you may remember that President Trump opened up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for oil and gas activity. Again, this is a moratorium, and if you read the executive order, I believe it says that it's a moratorium to review the actions that were taken by the Trump administration and the activity that has been conducted. It also revokes the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline, which, as I'm sure you are aware, is an underground pipeline that was largely been constructed to carry oil from Canada down to the Gulf of Mexico. So again, that permit has been revoked under this executive order. So you're seeing a lot of activity here to kind of step back and reflect on what has been done previously, as well as trying to find steps forward, and also taking steps to kind of stop and I guess stop any new activity that may contribute to climate change. So I want to make sure I highlight that. Let's go to the next slide here. So we're going to talk about the second executive order now, which is Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad, Executive Order 14,008, issued on January 27, 2021. So the president in this executive order does a couple of things. He establishes the White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy and the National Climate Task Force. Again, this is a reinstatement of the president's commitment to addressing climate change, and I think operationalizing within the White House an apparatus for addressing climate change. So, you have an Office of Domestic Climate Policy, which will help inform some of the policies that go out to combat climate change. There's also one here I think is very important for tribal governments, and that is he calls for the creation of the Federal Clean Energy and Vehicle Procurement Strategy, one aspect of which is the procurement of clean and zero emissions vehicles for federal, state, local, and tribal governmental fleets. So the goal here is obviously if you're a state, local, tribal government, then these executive order seeks to make it so you can get these clean energy vehicles pretty easily and begin replacing some of the more, outdated, fuel inefficient vehicles that may be currently being used. Obviously, as we see governments start to turn over their vehicles, the goal is to make sure that the new generation of vehicles, are clean and zero emissions. So that's part of this executive order as well. It's kind of a goal towards working towards that, and the federal government kind of giving and lending a hand towards making that happen. And well, that's something that we'll be watching to kind of see how that rolls out in Indian country. Next slide. So one of the other things it does is it calls for the Secretary of the Interior to review existing permitting processes on public lands and offshore waters to find steps that can be taken to increase renewable energy production. Again, this is another directive towards the Interior Department to see what processes are in place now to get permits to create new energy. So we know that there's a huge reliance on natural gas. There's a huge reliance on your traditional oil, coal, your traditional sources of energy. What permitting processes are in place that can be used to give permits for wind energy, solar energy, and what can be done to encourage the production of renewable energy over some of the traditional, legacy, would be a word I would use to describe legacy energy sources that we've traditionally used. And again, you've got that goal of doubling wind production by 2030 as well. So it's also using some of the public lands and offshore, waters as places to put windmills and solar panels and things that can be used to create energy that's renewable and doesn't contribute to the climate crisis. And there's also a quote here, and I pulled this to the quote directly from the order, is that the Secretary of the Interior shall engage with tribal authorities regarding the development and management of renewable and conventional energy resources on tribal lands. So again, there's that call for working with tribes in this development of alternative energy sources, and the renewable energy sources such as solar, such as wind, that we're starting to see here. So there is that respect for tribal sovereignty and the directive to work with tribes to and really make tribes a part of the solution to the climate crisis. So I want to make sure I highlight that as well. Next slide. So there's also, again, the order pauses new oil and natural gas leases on public lands and offshore waters. I will draw the distinction here that this doesn't revoke with the exception of the Keystone XL pipeline and what I mentioned before, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It doesn't broadly revoke existing oil and natural gas leases, but it does put a pause on new oil and natural gas leases. Again, so the agency can review kind of what's going on and what needs to be done with a lot of these processes to kind of move towards renewable energy. Again, there's also the directive to see what fossil fuel subsidies are being provided by the different agencies. And there's also the directive to ensure the federal government is not directly subsidizing fossil fuels. And there's also a call, I believe, in here to maybe work with Congress to facilitate this as well. Again, the Biden administration has really put a premium on moving away from fossil fuels and some of the more conventional energy sources to more renewable energy. And again, this is a directive from the president, as I mentioned before, in his capacity as the head of the executive branch, towards the agency heads to take actions to kind of help that policy and in furtherance of that policy that he outlined previously. So I just want to make sure I highlight that. Next slide. So he also directs the National Ocean and Atmosphere Administration, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the Office of Science and Technology to produce a report on how to expand climate forecast capabilities and make that information available to the public. So you want to expand the information available to the public, and this will help with forecasting some of the effects of climate change. As I said before, climate change most acutely affects communities that have the fewest resources to mitigate its impacts. You think about whether it's deserts getting drier, the extreme weather events, wildfires. You think about a lot of these. The flooding that we've seen. You think about, and I use Al Gore's picture here, so I'll share the example of Hurricane Katrina. You think about that and the flooding that happened in New Orleans in the lower Ninth Ward, which was an impoverished community in New Orleans, but yet it was most susceptible to flooding, and it did get hit disproportionately hard. But yet that community lacked the resources to kind of mitigate a lot of, they didn't have a flood wall. They didn't have the resources to mitigate some of the most detrimental impacts of climate change. So again, if you give this information out to the public, making sure folks know this is what we're expecting to happen, it enables communities, again, such as New Orleans, which also had the issue during Hurricane Katrina that they hadn't updated their levee system. The levee wasn't adequate to support the surge in water that came through that hurricane. So again, by letting folks know about these impacts, you can also help communities plan for how to mitigate the impacts and work towards maybe acquiring the resources or partnering with folks who have resources to kind of mitigate some of these impacts as well. So this is also very important as well, is increasing the forecasting capability so we can know the impacts, but also making it available to the public so folks can begin to take steps to mitigate those impacts. So next slide. Another portion of this is, how do we conserve land, right? How do we, keep land from being, exploited and being used in ways that destroys natural beauty, that kind of take it away from the people, to be able to use and enjoy. The Secretary of the Interior is directed to work with other agency heads to submit a report that recommends steps that can be taken to conserve at least 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. And the agencies are directed to solicit input from state, local, tribal, and territorial officials, as well as other stakeholders. Again, when you think about land conservation and you think about what that means, for tribal communities, I think it's perhaps obvious that it means conserving our traditional homelands, for future generations to use and to have, and shielding it from development that in a lot of ways destroys the character of that land and removes it from our use. So this is, I think, very important and a very important step. And one of the things that I've noticed in reading these executive orders is that step towards conservation. And you think about, as I mentioned before, the mention of Bear Ears National Monument and the directive to review what was done under President Trump. The conservation of land and resources, it's important. It's important for future generations to be able to enjoy the land that our ancestors were able to enjoy. So This is one that I think is very important. And the fact that, you have that mention in there of, the agencies are directed to work with state, local, tribal, territorial officials, again, to make sure that whatever steps are taken are informed by those stakeholders. So I wanted to make sure I highlighted that. Let's go to the next slide. So the impact of these executive orders more broadly is that they attempt to mitigate the effects of climate change and create a plan for addressing it going forward. They also set forth the goal of conservation. They call for a pause in oil and gas permits, a review of the reduction of national monuments, and an active plan to conserve our lands. You think about, and I'll give another example here of why conservation is important and how that ties into oil and gas permits. So I think we're all familiar with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico about a decade ago now. And I think we're all familiar with the oil spills that have happened in other places as well. I mean, you think about the detrimental impact that an accident can have when you're drilling in the ocean or you're drilling on land, even, and the water, it destroys wildlife. It gets into our water supply. It gets into the soil. I mean, the goal of conservation and the goal of making sure that, we're able to mitigate some of these things and we're able to prevent some of these disasters from happening, I think, is a policy that the president has embraced. I will say that executive orders, as I said this earlier, executive orders are the start of the conversation. The president does have a lot of lofty goals for impacting climate change and impacting pollution and impacting a lot of these environmental hazards that we so often see. But there has to be follow through. So I encourage everyone to keep watching what's coming out of the White House. Don't be afraid to speak up if you feel as though things aren't, your tribes aren't being consulted in a proper manner, or things aren't moving forward, and I think that it's obviously executive orders, I always say, is an opportunity for advocacy. They open the door, and they are a great vehicle through which you can kind of hold the administration accountable to the goals that they set forth. So again, this is the start of the conversation. I encourage everyone to pay attention, to be advocates, and be an active participant going forward in making sure these goals get accomplished. As I said, climate change is probably the most important issue in the world in terms of the long-term environment that we're going to be living in, and we're beginning to see some of the impacts of climate change now. So achieving the goals set forth by the president, I think, will be important to mitigating those impacts, and I think everyone should be engaged on ensuring that these things move forward. So next slide. So if you have any questions, please contact me. I love to discuss these issues. I think, as you heard during my introduction, the rural communities are a passion of mine and resource in, especially rural tribal communities, and climate change, I think, has no greater impact than our rural communities. So I'm always happy to discuss these issues, and just send me an email or give me a call, and I'll be happy to help. So I'm happy to answer any questions right now that anyone may have.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was splendid. Yes, so we will leave it open now for questions. Chris is the expert, so if you have questions, please feel free to, I think, raise your hand or just pop them in the chat, and we'll go ahead and get started on our question session. So this is the time if you want to have questions for our policy experts. Oh, here's Shasta. Okay, Shasta, you ready?
Good morning, and thank you so much, Chris. That was a great presentation, and I really appreciate you making the time for us this morning. And I'm really, of course, pleased that President Biden has released these executive orders on climate change, and we're making some, hopefully, progress to make up for the last 4 years where there was more denial than anything. And my question from a policy standpoint is not even really so much specific to tribes and climate change, but it's just something I've been considering in general, and it's presidential action on making the consequences of climate change more of a regulatory issue for companies. And by that, I mean, do you know if there's any thought in the administration about making companies responsible for what they do in terms of the products they create, or whatever it is that they sell, and not putting the pressure on the consumer to be the ones to say make sure they recycle things, or change their own behavior, when it's really industry that needs to change its ways.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything directly from the administration on that. I will say that there may be some, they're kind of maybe boxed in a little bit on what they can do, because you may need congressional action to levy certain penalties. I'm not entirely sure where the president's authority would be within that, because you have to imagine, I mean, the administration, I feel like in this arena has to be careful, and they have to kind of go slow. If the administration were the issuing executive order imposing penalties on private industry, you have to imagine there's going to be a lawsuit almost immediately after that. So I think that I don't speak for the administration, obviously. I know that's something that is a policy goal, might be something they want to do. I don't know if they want to do that, but I think it would be something that you would probably feel more comfortable going through Congress to do that, just because of the fact that it will be challenged in the courts, and court battles tend to be pretty lengthy. So I don't know where the administration is on that, but that's kind of my thought process on where they may be on it.
Thanks, I appreciate that. And before I remute, I do have another more specific question about climate change in Indian country. So I run the Tribal Climate Health Project, which has fortunately been funded by multiple agencies, including NIHB, and that's partly why I'm here. But there was funding that was made available to us right at the beginning of the Trump administration, and then when he was elected, that funding was pulled. So I'm wondering if you know anything about new funding avenues or increased funding for tribes to work on climate adaptation.
I haven't heard anything on that, but I can look into that for you.
All right, that'd be great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you, Shasta. So Chris, there's one question in the chat that I might actually be able to answer a little more, but I'll just throw it out to you. So Mr. Dan Cannon says, is the National Indian Health Board working with tribal communities across the country to coordinate advocacy efforts around 30 by 30? If so, how can folks engage? Yeah.
So I will defer to you on that one, because I'm tracking that one very closely.
Absolutely. So as of right now, we have not coordinated any efforts to engage in this, but I can say that we will soon, and we will likely be holding a listening session for tribal communities to be able to, give their input and their opinions on how they think this initiative would be best accomplished in Indian country. So stay tuned. Okay, anybody else have any questions for Chris? You can raise your hand or throw them in the chat. I always love this pause. Is NIHB responding to via oh my goodness. Okay, here they come. Okay. I am assuming April Taylor is asking, is NIHB responding via a letter to the 30 for 30 initiative? I am assuming that we will, depending on where policy also would like to cross paths with that. So yes, keep an eye out. And then oh, the EO. Thank you. As of right now, no, we're kind of waiting to see what Secretary Holland puts out. So thank you for that question. That's a good question. And then Dr. Steve Conkle said, can you address the significance of the ANWR and the Keystone pipeline decisions? That's Alaska Native Wildlife Refuge.
Yeah, so I mean, those decisions are pretty big because those are pretty big projects. Obviously, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is a huge, it's a huge undeveloped plot of land that was set aside to be preserved for nature. So the idea that you would allow oil and gas drillers to go in and drill that is, I mean, it's been a controversial political issue for probably all my life. So I mean, it's significant the fact that you're putting a stop to that, and you're recommitting to that policy. This is a set aside plot of land that we're conserving. Again, it goes into that broader narrative of the Biden administration of, we need to conserve, land. We need to conserve. I think the goal was 30% of our land. So I would say that denying that permit or put a moratorium on permits rather, and ANWR kind of, it feeds into that broader policy goal. So that's the significance of it. It's also a rather large piece of land in Alaska. And, it would be detrimental to both the natural beauty and the wildlife and everything else in that area to allow oil and gas permits. So that's the significance of it. The other point on what was the other part of the question? Sorry,
it's can you address the significance of the ANWR and the Keystone pipeline decisions?
Okay, Keystone, yep. So I think this is a move by the Biden administration. We saw a lot of controversy around pipelines. Certainly, we all remember the Doppel controversy as well. I think it's just a move by the Biden administration, a policy move to discourage the development of underground pipelines. We've all heard about the dangers of, as I said earlier, what if this stuff leaks into the water supply or gets into the soil? So I think this was just symbolic of the greater commitment towards moving towards more sustainable forms of energy and away from fossil fuels as well. And there's also a broader policy discussion on how much benefit the Keystone pipeline would actually have to the American fuel market. But I don't think that drove the decision. I think it was more a broader decision to discourage that kind of development and move towards a more sustainable future.
Great, thanks. Okay, so we'll go with Brett's question. This is also policy related. So beyond the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, what other federal agencies should tribes work with on environmental health issues?
I would say any department that touches wildlife, any department that touches, conservation. I would also look at departments like the Department of Transportation, right? There has been a movement by Secretary Pete Buttigieg to kind of move towards sustainable, transportation development, expanding public transportation. You want to look at other departments such as the Department of Agriculture, right? You think about the role of farming in agriculture. You want to encourage the use of, zero emissions farm equipment. You want to encourage the use of more sustainable farming practices to prevent soil runoff. So that's another area. You also want to start looking at HHS operating divisions, such as the CDC, for example, and I saw that in the chat. You also want to look at HRSA. Do they administer the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy? So obviously it's something that addresses, rural. They have an interest in climate change. So you may want to look to them as well. I think that, almost every arm of the federal government has a role to play in mitigating climate change. But outside of, HHS and outside of the Interior Department, I would be looking towards the Department of Agriculture, certainly, as well as the Department of Transportation, and the Department of Transportation, especially because they do have a stated goal of, encouraging public transportation and development of more sustainable forms of transit. I think yesterday, Secretary Buttigieg tweeted, everyone should be able to live in a place where they're not relying on cars to get around. I think it's a little ambitious, but I think that does kind of point to the goal of the Department of Transportation to reduce emissions and kind of move towards more sustainable transportation, which, I think we all know one of the largest polluters or one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gases, is the personal automobile. And if we can do anything we can to kind of mitigate that, whether it's creating, cleaner cars or encouraging public transportation, we'll have a pretty significant impact on climate change.
Thanks. I think Shasta's raising her hand again, so I'll let her contribute unless I'm mistaken.
I am not raising my hand again. I'm just waving my hands around in the air like a crazy person. So I will lower my hand now.
I did see in the chat where you gave me your email address, and I'll make sure to note that. And thank you for that.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, sorry about that, Shasta. Okay, so then someone is also asking for what the third executive order dealing with international climate is. Then I also want to, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and that one I think it dealt with climate migration, climate-based migration, and kind of the policy of the United States to be more open to climate refugees. And as I said earlier, the brunt of climate change is being, borne by the communities that, are least equipped to fight it. I gave the example of New Orleans. I think that's a powerful example. We're also seeing, around the world, right? You've got impoverished countries that, they're built on, lower land and sea level. They're experiencing floods. They're experiencing extreme temperatures. They're experiencing, changes just in the ability to, farm. Right. You're seeing, desert areas become more dry. You're seeing areas that used to get, an adequate amount of rain for farming, no longer getting that amount of rain. So, I mean, and you're seeing that in the United States, but you're seeing it, abroad in countries that don't have the resources to deal with that. And then I think you have the most foundational question of human survival, which is, where do I get food? Where do I get shelter? Where do I go where I can actually survive? And I haven't done a super deep dive on that executive order, but my understanding is that that executive order kind of deals with the issue of migration, and commits the United States, or I don't know if it commits, but it certainly moves the United States towards being more accepting of climate refugees. So that is an issue that I think will be more in the forefront in the next 4 to 8 years, certainly.
Perfect, thanks. Okay, so the next question is, this might also be a public health area. Have you gathered data on the health implications of tribes connected to climate change? Is this being woven into advocacy efforts, or how climate change is impacting tribal homelands, tribal culture and tradition, and how this impacts physical, spiritual, and the physical and spiritual health of tribal citizens?
So can you repeat the question again? Sorry.
Sure. Yeah, it was a little lengthy. Yeah, we'll start with the first
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, we'll start with the first one. Have you gathered data on the health implications of tribes connected to climate change?
So we have not collected that data, at least in the policy center. I don't know if it's being tracked elsewhere. I think that is something that will have to be tracked in the coming years as we start seeing the impacts of climate change. But it's not something that I don't think that we have data on at this point.
Yeah, the same thing for public health. We are really still in the advocacy area. And then like the second part of this question is this being woven into advocacy efforts? I know that the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, is currently making an effort in collecting climate-based data on populations. And I know they're focusing more on Native American and Alaska Native populations as well. So then from that, advocacy will come. So the second part of that question is, or the third part of this is, how does climate change impact? No, that's still an adding on to. So this is this being woven into advocacy efforts? And then how is climate change impacting tribal homelands, tribal culture and tradition, and how all of this impacts our spiritual and physical health of tribal citizens? Yes, I will say that once the data, if there is, once we have access to it, we do highly advocate and understand the importance of spiritual and homelands and tribal lands to communities. So absolutely.
Yeah, and I'll give an example of how climate change is impacting tribal communities. I'll use my own tribal community in North Carolina as an example. Within the course of 3 years, we had 2 once-in-a-100-year floods, right? And which is obviously a huge burden on the community. I grew up in a very impoverished community, a community that's ill-equipped to deal with it. So I think when you're dealing with your homelands experiencing the impacts of climate change, it does have an impact, and you have to, as a community, figure out how do you adjust to the new reality that you're going to be seeing these once-in-a-100-year floods, or what should be once-in-a-100-year floods, on a more frequent basis. So, I mean, it has had an impact. I don't think there's data to quantify that impact, but I think you can probably measure that anecdotally, and whether it's extreme weather events or floods or something of that nature. this is having, this is already having an impact in Indian country.
Thank you. That was a great example. There's the next question that's asking who oversees the EPA. I could not find out. I am a little too scared to go onto my Google Chrome browser if it goes out of the screen, but oh, I see Nancy is raising her hand, so we'll let you talk if you would like.
Yep. Oh.
Yeah, I just have been, the University of New Mexico has been running a climate change and health series, and I think there's like 3 left, but I just wondered who oversees the EPA. I know I talked to the Department of Health, the lead guy in Maricopa County, and he could not tell me, so I wondered who is overseeing that agency.
Yeah.
So Michael Regan is the administrator of the EPA right now. He was
right, but what agency oversees them? Who do they answer to?
I believe it is the Interior Department, but let me just verify that very quickly here. It is within, actually it is not under a department, it's a standalone agency.
Yeah.
So yeah, they answer to their administrator. They report directly to the president. So
just a heads up, you may not want to look into it, but water testing in this country, it is quite scary. And what gets tested and what does not. Out of very bad benzenes, maybe 5 out of 250, and you can cherry pick those 5. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's not in the best interest of citizens.
Yeah, that reminds me of a story, actually. When I was in high school, I did a report on the river that runs through the county I grew up in, which is also the source, or one of the sources, rather, of the local drinking supply. And part of that was very basic testing. You just buy a kit off of Amazon or whatever, and you just dip a stick in and you see what chemicals are present. It was very scary once I was done with that report. So yeah, there's certainly a huge issue. And obviously we know about the Flint water crisis, and elevated levels of lead in the water in those communities. So that definitely is a very important issue.
And lead gets tested every 9 years.
Yeah. NIHB in a different part of our environmental health programs, it's not directly related to climate ready tribes. We are working on a lead report that will hopefully come out soon. I'm not the coordinator on that, so don't know the exact details, but there is effort from NIHB and recognition of the horrible pollutants that are in water still. So I appreciate you bringing attention to that too, Nancy.
Well, and also too, talking about industry, Texaco every year, they have been fined yearly to clean up the Chesapeake Bay. And instead of doing that, they simply pay their fines. It's a lot less to pay the fine. And NRDC takes them to court every year to clean it up, and they just pay the fine not to. Yeah. So the industrial accountability is not enforced at all either.
Yeah. And for those of us in the DC area, obviously the Chesapeake Bay issue is very important because it is obviously a very local issue for us. So that's, a very, very important issue.
Well, just let you know, there's a lot that, if he did pass this, then maybe with numbers, I mean, all the nations, Indian country and the whole country makes up 1/5 the size of the United States. That is a huge power right there. Land-wise.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that also goes back to the advocacy point that Shasta was making earlier about, keeping that advocacy going and putting, having consequences and actual consequences for these, corporations that aren't just monetary. That's where the advocacy comes from. And that's something that we'll definitely look into putting, more effort into as we go.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Oh, I have one comment from Melinda Chase. FYI, on the Alaska Native Wildlife Refuge, the state of Alaska is trying to pass a legislative joint resolution to urge the president to rescind EO 13990, open ANWR, and asking the Alaska congressional delegation to work on this, which is not a surprise. During a State of Alaska Legislative Resource Committee 2 days ago, the chair cut off public testimony on this resolution and privileged the pro-oil development testimony. Yep. So.
Yeah, I would not be surprised. You know, I would actually be surprised if that executive order isn't eventually revoked by the president. But yeah, I mean, we'll see. But right now, obviously, everything is paused in that area.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Chris. So with 5 minutes left to go in our allotted hour, I would love to welcome a couple more questions. If anyone has them, kind of last chance, but then you also have Chris's email there as well. And you'll also be getting my email with the evaluation that I send out as well. So anybody else? Last call.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you all for attending this. Please do not hesitate to send me an email. If I don't know the answer to a question, I can definitely research it and try to find you the answer. I am available if anyone has any follow-up questions.
Great. Getting lots of thanks to Chris and great jobs. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much again for joining us. We really appreciate you spending your hour with us this afternoon on a Friday, especially. And yep, keep an eye out for that evaluation link. Like I said, we really appreciate when you fill those out because it helps us improve and also figure out which webinars to do next and topics to host next. I will also give a plug really fast for the Tribal Public Health Summit that is coming up between April 27th and 29th. If you are interested in attending, you can go ahead and register on our NIHB website, nihb.org, and hopefully we might see you there. So again, thank you so much, everyone. We appreciate you all being here today. I will stop sharing and I will end. See ya.